This webinar is brought to you by Climate Change Education Solutions Network at GVSU. And this is our monthly webinar on climate vulnerability and justice. And it's a part of our Miracle series. Miracle stands for Michigan Resources on Climate and Land Change Education. So welcome to all our K-12 teachers and everyone who is here with us on the webinar. My name is Elena Lubimtseva. I'm a professor of geography and sustainable planning at Grand Valley. And here with me, my very dear friend and colleague, Janet Vale of Ennis Water Resources Institute. Janet, thank you so much for being here. And of course, we have today a very special guest, Professor Paul Clements. So Paul is an amazing climate warrior and enabler from Western Michigan University, which is just about 1 hour from Grand Valley. So both Western Michigan and GVSU are on the western side of the great state of Michigan. And Paul is a scholar, he is a teacher, he is supervising many graduate students, and he is also a politician. So he is really fighting climate change in so many different dimensions. He's a professor of political science at Western Michigan University, where he also directs the master program in international development administration. And he also is a director of the graduate certificate in climate change policy and management. Paul Clements received his bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University and PhD in public affairs from Princeton University. He has conducted evaluation of development project and worked on evaluation systems in many developing countries. He worked in Bangladesh, in a number of African countries, in Brazil, in Southeast Asia, and he was the Democratic candidate for Congress in Michigan's 6th District in 2014 and again in 2016. And so we really need more people in Congress of the United States with the same depth of understanding of the issues of climate change as Professor Clements. He's very active in Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. So being a member of Grand Rapids Climate Coalition, I have been following very closely what the Kalamazoo Climate Coalition is doing. And in many ways, we have been modeling our efforts on what you have done in Kalamazoo. Paul is also one of the co-founders of Climate Change Working Group at Western Michigan University, who has been so active, really making Western Michigan University a champion and in many ways a model for other universities in Michigan, including Grand Valley, on what academic institutions should do and must do on climate change. And I really hope that we here at Grand Valley will follow in the footsteps of Western and do significantly more than what we are trying to do right now. So welcome, Paul. I also want to encourage all our audience and our students to read your books on climate ethics. And this is also on top of my to-do list. I want to know more about your research and your scholarship. Thank you so much for being here, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Elena, for that gracious introduction. Thanks everyone for joining us from around Michigan and around the country, around the world. Just very briefly, before I get into the question of climate justice, as Elena mentioned, I direct our new graduate certificate program at Western Michigan University on climate change policy and management. It's only 6 classes to get a sort of basic foundation, with the idea that then that might complement other studies. I've been teaching a class on managing challenges from climate change since we started this a few years ago. Okay, so I'm delighted today to speak about the topic of teaching climate justice. I will say that I generally try to approach climate change from the justice perspective. I think that's kind of the right way to approach it. So I'll start off by sharing my screen. So teaching climate justice is I think really a challenging thing, partly because it requires a global or international perspective, and Americans generally aren't so accustomed to taking that international perspective, but also partly because this is an area where the adult world has really been failing our students, failing the young people around us, and teaching about something where the adult world is failing people, failing the students you're teaching to, the young people. I think that's also just makes it really tough. It's a very complicated topic. What I'm trying to do today is draw together what I understand to be the central issues with climate justice. Many of these issues, you could have a whole class or even series of classes. I've taught a whole class or many classes on some of these topics, but I'm trying to put together a sort of overview of the issues, and I'd be happy to go into greater depth on any of them in our Q&A session. So by now, most people are familiar with the harms from climate change. It's very much here. The forest fires, the droughts, the floods, more floods, the stronger hurricanes, and so many more harms that we experience from climate change. We know very well, it's very common, except for the few deniers, that climate change is mainly caused by carbon dioxide emissions, increasing since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And so as we discuss teaching climate justice, I'm going to kind of assume you've already covered the basic science, that's not what we're trying to deal with here. So then the question comes, well, what is climate justice? And I think to approach this question, it's helpful to start from a more fundamental question, and that is, what is justice itself? Well, in our Western tradition, for the last basically 2,500 years, we've understand justice as the basic concern is giving each person what he or she deserves, or as it sometimes is said, giving each person his or her due. Then the question becomes, well, what does that mean in different contexts? So I think the starting point for climate justice needs to be that we each contribute individually to climate change in our regular lives, as we burn gasoline in our cars, as we use electricity from coal-fired power plants, as we consume goods that are produced using electricity. And the firms, the companies that sell us these things, they benefit from selling it to us, and we benefit from using this stuff. We also benefit collectively in each country from our country's industrialization. So for example, if you're fortunate to be born into the United States, it's a highly industrialized country, but that industrialization contributed so much to climate change. Whereas if you're born in a low-income developing country, probably your country hasn't contributed very much. And so then as carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, it imposes all these harms. But from a justice perspective, we want to understand that these harms are imposed on specific persons, specific individuals, individual people. And so it's sort of like, on the one hand, there's the people who create climate change. On the other hand, there's the people who suffer the harms. So to give each person their due, the questions are, first, what is our responsibility individually and nationally? And secondly, what is due to the people who suffer these harms individually and nationally? So this is the kind of the framework I'm going to be using. A complicating factor here, you may already have thought of this, is that the policies that affect climate change are mostly worked out at the national level and in international negotiations, mostly by national governments. We bear responsibility as individuals for harms from climate change, but this responsibility is mediated by national governments and other governments. And most of us don't feel like we have a lot of influence over national policy. But also, I think we need to see that national governments they do not represent our individual responsibilities very well. They aren't very effective agents with regard to these issues. So in this regard, in terms of the responsibilities, I think it's helpful to think of three broad areas. And these are, well, pretty widely accepted, I think. Actually, the first two are accepted pretty widely anyway. The first is mitigation. And that is, how do we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions so we don't have too much climate change, right? And we're all familiar with this in terms of maybe driving like an electric vehicle, or getting solar panels, or reducing our carbon footprints in other ways, or nationally trying to reduce our national greenhouse gas emissions by certain targets. So mitigation is just reducing these greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a whole Again, you can teach whole classes on this topic, how that's been approached. The second area of responsibility is adaptation. That's the term that gets used for limiting the harmful effects of climate change, either before or after the harm occurs. So places like Miami that expect to see rising sea levels are building big seawalls. Chicago and London are building cooling centers for when they have heat waves. California is making better preparations for forest fires, that sort of thing. And then the third area that I emphasize, although this one has not been emphasized so much in international negotiations, is climate migrants, supporting people who lose their homes and/or livelihoods and have to move. I think that the greatest victims are, of course, people who lose their lives. But secondly, I think it is the climate migrants, because there's so many of them. They're probably the most significant class of victims of climate change. Then for each of these areas, we need to sort of separate it into the advanced countries and the developing countries. Generally speaking, people in advanced countries have high responsibility and low vulnerability, relatively speaking, whereas people in developing countries generally have relatively low responsibility but high vulnerability to the harm from climate change. And this is very basic. This sort of sets the context for the problems of climate justice. To give a bit of details data to back that up, if we look at the cumulative per capita carbon dioxide emissions by country, and if we look at the top 4 countries, this is in terms of all their emissions up until very recently, over the last maybe a couple hundred years, but then looking at them in terms of per capita based on the current population. So Canada has the highest per capita emissions, cumulative per person at 1,751 tons. The United States is below that, Estonia, then Australia. These are the top 4 countries in terms of cumulative per capita emissions. I also include a number of countries sort of at the other end of the spectrum: Chad, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, and Afghanistan. The first 4 countries in Africa, they all have none of these countries is above 5 tons per person. So the difference between 5 tons and like 1,500 tons is obviously an enormously different contribution to the problem. In terms of adaptation readiness, it's a very complicated issue, but the University of Notre Dame has developed a global adaptation initiative. And part of that is what they call the ND Gain Index. And you can just look it up online if you're interested, where they analyze vulnerability and readiness for essentially all the countries in the world. And if you look at the countries that I had on the previous slide on the right-hand side, those are the lowest ranked countries in the ND Gain Index, the 182nd, 181st. And then I included Afghanistan because it's the first non-African country. Although if we look at Afghanistan, the data might be a bit dated. Today, they might be even more vulnerable than they were at that time. So mostly African countries at the very bottom. Then the countries that have had the most contribution, well, Norway was not one of the top 4, but they're they're the least vulnerable and most ready. So they rank number 1 in the ND Gain Index, and the other countries rank between 12 and 22, as you can see. So the countries that have contributed the most are also the least vulnerable and the most ready, relatively speaking. So looking then at the question of justice between persons, but mediated by governments, we should look at it both within countries and between countries. Within countries, there's clearly an obligation to help the victims, and this is pretty well understood of, for example, extreme weather events. We see that when we have floods and heat waves and so on, and extreme weather in the United States, that our government comes in and it tries to help in various ways. And obviously, in advanced countries, developed countries, we're better at this, and in the very poor countries, they may have a harder time by this. It's undertaken mostly by government, but if you and I were in the midst of this problem, like if they had the storms like in West Virginia, helping our neighbors, helping whatever we can, it's an individual obligation, but it's mostly undertaken by governments in the United States, federal and state governments. In this regard, the outcomes tend to reflect both within and, well, both in all the different countries, both pre-existing competencies and biases. So from a justice perspective, well, the advanced countries have stronger competencies, they can do more, but they also have their own biases. If we look back as far back as Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the government came in, the FEMA to help people get their houses back, but about 900,000 African Americans, mostly very poor people, never came back. Most of the help actually went to relatively middle class and higher income people. So the pre-existing biases may deepen pre-existing injustices. That would be similar. Generally, we see people of color, marginalized populations around the world maybe get less help from their governments. Similarly, between countries, well, here it's a different picture because we've had negotiations at the international level since 1992 through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This convention, the term convention, both refers to the original agreement and the subsequent agreements, and also to the organization of all these different meetings, UNFCCC. The principles that were stated in the original 1992 convention are actually pretty fair. But if we look at the outcomes don't fit the principles very well. They really tend to reflect national interests in tension with these principles, and I'll have more to say about this. Generally speaking, the advanced country governments have avoided responsibility in these negotiations, whereas developing country governments have promoted national and government interests as best they can, trying to get some help from the advanced countries and trying to prepare. But generally, in these negotiations, we see the well-being of climate migrants who are particularly severe victims have mostly been neglected. There's been no specific mechanism set up to address climate migrants, and the known challenges, as we'll talk about, have been pretty much ignored. The sort of main agreement that we all know about from UNFCCC for mitigation comes out of the 2015 Paris Agreement, with the goal, many of us are familiar, to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Although I will say that from my reading of the science, even though they talk about 1.5, I think 1.5 is really off the table. Really, even 2 degrees is really challenging, but that's maybe another discussion of the science. However, so the Paris Agreement leaves national mitigation targets up to each individual country. This is, I think, a great weakness, but it was the best they could do in Paris politically. And so most countries, both the individual targets that countries have agreed to aren't enough to limit warming to 2 degrees. Right now, they're at about maybe 2.8 degrees. But even with those targets, mostly countries aren't doing enough even to reach those targets that they've set for themselves. So the countries are not anywhere close to what the science would say would be needed for reaching the Paris Agreement goal. So what does this mean for climate justice? Well, if we look at the amount of carbon dioxide that can get back into the atmosphere to still keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, that would give us a carbon budget, all right, about what would be the total amount of carbon dioxide. So climate justice would need to involve a fair division of this carbon budget among countries to keep global warming below this 2 degrees, but still allow developing countries to industrialize. And the Paris Agreement really talks about developing countries needing to industrialize, but it doesn't talk about a carbon budget because they couldn't agree to that. But I think we're going to need to go there, either for 2 degrees or for whatever. So the second thing then is a fair implementation of this national carbon budget within each country. If they just said, all right, we're going to raise the cost of all gasoline and all the carbon products, that would hit the poor really hard. And we've just seen in Kazakhstan, when they doubled the price of gas, that they saw major demonstrations, and just in the last few days. So an example of fair implementation might be the proposed Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And I know Tim is watching us here from the Citizens Climate Lobby, so I wanted to point out the great work of Citizens Climate Lobby promoting this, which is a gradually increasing carbon tax with the proceeds divided equally among the American people to make it fair. Okay, then the third area is that advanced countries really need to help developing countries to transition to renewable energy. And for some people, this means even just to gain electricity for the first time. And there's a lot of work to be done in that area. So other aspects of fair mitigation, well, people who lose their jobs from carbon-based industries need some help to find the new jobs. But also, we've been seeing for all these last few decades that the oil and coal companies and the firms that really benefit from profits from carbon pollution, many of them really have been promoting climate science denial and intentionally confusing the public with false information to protect their profits. So how do we hold these companies accountable? That's a big question for fair mitigation. And then even though they're not as strong on climate change denial as they used to be, they're still using all kinds of means to protect their profits. So how do we resist those oil and coal companies? That's another big part of the problem here. So moving on. The second area is adaptation. With mitigation, everyone needs to mitigate to protect the environment for everyone. But with adaptation, you need to adapt to protect yourself, either at the individual or state or country level. Everyone will do better if they prepare, e.g. for increasing heat, rising sea levels, stronger storms, etc. But clearly, the advanced countries are better equipped to adapt. And many developing countries, as well as being less well equipped, face greater dangers from climate change, from drought, life-threatening heat, sea level rise, etc. So, you can go into the details of this, but from a climate justice perspective, the overall position is clear. That is that advanced countries really need to help developing countries to adapt. Depending on the level of harm, where there's greater harms, they need to help more, and ability, they need to help more where the ability is less, to protect national economies and individual lives and livelihoods. And again, I want to emphasize that from a justice perspective, it's not so much a question of the level of harm as the threat to lives and livelihoods that is the key issue here. And so the most help is usually needed in those countries where the harms are worst, but also where the governments are weakest. But governments from advanced countries representing national interests aren't doing nearly enough to address these adaptation needs. First, they've just failed to stem their own increase in carbon pollution, or the global increase. So the need for adaptation continues to grow, and the more recent science tends to indicate even greater harms, indicating greater need for adaptation. From as far back as 2009, the advanced countries promised $100 billion a year from 2020 to help with mitigation adaptation, but with any kind of fair accounting, they've been giving less than $50 billion a year, not nearly enough of what they said. Most of this money is going for mitigation, while the developing countries want half and half for mitigation and adaptation. And the advanced countries kind of agreed to this in Paris, but they've not been doing it. Even the money that's going out, not enough is going to the countries that did the most. And even if all this 100 billion went to adaptation, this 100 billion a year just isn't nearly enough for the needs as they're known right now. And this is very well documented. Plus then, and this is in terms of my specialization in international development, a lot of this money is just not being spent very effectively to address the needs. So long story short, adaptation is a mess. With weak mitigation globally and weak adaptation in developing countries, the harm from climate change will increase, leading to greater human suffering, possibly to government breakdowns and international conflicts, but also increasing the burden of responsibility on the advanced countries. And in particular, failures in mitigation and adaptation lead to more climate migrants. That's where I'm going now. So with climate migrants, already there are 80 million international refugees and internally displaced people, the term is IDPs, worldwide, more than any time in history. And maybe about a third of these were forced to move in part due to climate change, although there are always other factors. Even with 80 million, immigration is causing increasing political problems in many countries around the world. Here in the United States, we saw Donald Trump running for president on a promise to build a wall with Mexico. We've seen immigration almost lead to the breakup of European Union, in fact, contributing to that with the UK's departure and other troubles there. But there are troubles in India, in Australia, in many countries around the world, migrants. There's increasing anti-immigrant sentiment, even though we know that we're going to see many, many more migrants in the future. Depending upon success in mitigation adaptation, we could very well see, I'd say, at least 200 million additional climate migrants, both internationally and IDPs internally in countries by 2050. So from a climate justice perspective, we need to recognize that today, climate migrants are not given the same rights as refugees. The 1954 Refugee Convention, that was the Geneva Convention after World War II, established certain rights for refugees that all countries recognize, but you have to be oppressed in various ways to get these rights. And we don't count climate migrants as refugees. So instead, climate migrants are today treated as economic migrants with hardly any rights. Sometimes the United States kept in cages and treated very badly. In other countries also treated very badly, or just sent home. So what is needed? Well, the advanced countries first off need to help developing countries to care for their own internal climate migrants, the IDPs. And this is going to be a major issue. This is probably the first thing that needs to be done, that if people can stay in their own country with adequate support, that's probably the best solution. But this is going to fail more and more. And when this does fail and people do migrate internationally, then we need to recognize that this international migration, we caused this. We caused the climate change that is causing this migration. So the advanced countries need to welcome and integrate these migrants from a justice perspective, with somehow each country accepting a fair number of migrants. Well, that's another question. What is it fair? Okay, so, but national governments reflecting national interests have been rejecting any responsibility for climate migrants. That's why it's gotten nowhere in the UNFCCC Paris Agreement or other negotiations. We, citizens of advanced countries, bear responsibility for the harms imposed on climate migrants. Without our carbon pollution, they wouldn't have had to leave their homes. So where will tens of millions of climate migrants go, and how will their rights be secured? This is a big challenge facing the young people of today. So then the basic dynamics of climate justice. Mitigation failure, leads to greater need for adaptation. Adaptation failures, particularly in poor countries, leads to more climate migrants. And mitigation is failing, adaptation is failing. The failures to care for climate migrants increase human suffering, but also increase conflicts within and between countries. The governments of advanced countries that are protecting their national interests are failing to adequately represent the responsibilities due to our contributions to carbon pollution. This is, I think, is sort of the crux of the climate justice challenge. So here's my proposal. My suggestions for teaching climate justice, that the objectives ought to be, number one, understanding the basics of mitigation, adaptation, and climate migration and how they're connected. Number two, understanding failures of advanced countries in these areas. Number three, understanding how these failures will increase injustices and the burdens of responsibilities on today's students when they're adults. And number four, well, all these problems will lead to a need for stronger international cooperation, stronger international institutions for mitigation, adaptation, and climate migrants. And I'm going to also add a lot of money. A lot of these political problems come down to financial issues, and I basically don't. It could come from more taxes, but from a security perspective, I think it might help to think about climate change as a security and justice issue, and money that's currently being spent on the military might be one source, or if we don't want to just raise taxes for everybody for what's needed there. All of these are big political challenges, and I have a whole different presentation on how to approach the politics. But in terms of understanding the issues of climate justice, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, and I'd be delighted for any questions.
Thank you so much for this really brilliant presentation. I see that we have many questions from the audience, and I will just read them as they come. So the first question is, how did you draft the climate action plan in Kalamazoo? Is it finished? Does it include reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
So a few years ago, the city planner in Kalamazoo came to our climate change working group and said the city would like help getting started with the climate action plan. And so I was able to offer with my master's program, we have our capstone seminar is on planning development programs. So we just took the challenge to draft a climate action plan for Kalamazoo. Rebecca Kick was our city planner. We met with her weekly and put off a first draft of a climate action plan, which is 90% about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and a tiny bit about adaptation. And since then, the city government has just made pretty gradual progress. We recommended first, hiring a couple people to manage it. Well, they haven't yet hired anybody to manage it. This is now like 3 years later. So the politics goes slowly for us on this issue. I will say that if you want to look at a really ambitious climate action plan at a city level in Michigan, you should look at Ann Arbor's. They want to go carbon neutral within 10 years by 2030. It's a very ambitious plan, and even if they don't reach everything they've tried to target, it's really dramatic what they're trying to do, and they're putting a lot of. They've got at least like 10 people working on it. Kalamazoo doesn't even have one person working full time. But I will say that the political support for this is increasing within the Kalamazoo, the city, and the county, and other towns around the area.
Does this climate action plan for Kalamazoo right now also include a climate adaptation plan?
They've talked about adaptation. There's elements there, but again, none of it really has gotten very far in terms of implementation.
Thank you. When I'll go into the next question, how do you feel about graphic packaging in Kalamazoo expanding next to an African-American frontline community, increasing greenhouse emissions by 221% and cutting down 721 trees for their new office space near the river? The city of Kalamazoo gave them land, zoning approvals, and millions in tax breaks to expand. Did you inform them this decision was horrible for climate change and humans? The pollution gets trapped in the valley and is making residents sick with asthma and COPD. So I also would project this question.
Sure. Well, as I said earlier on, responses to climate change tend to reflect pre-existing biases. And this is, one example here in Kalamazoo. I will say that in my own academic work, I really have been focusing more on the global perspective and what's needed for national and global climate justice, partly because that's really where the core action is. Here in Kalamazoo, I'm delighted that we have well, I'll mention Denise Keel is the chair of our, and she's great, she's wonderful, of our Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition and our Climate Change Working Group. And she, I will say, more than I, has been more engaged on a day-to-day basis with our local city government operations. I don't know all the details even of the issue, the graphic packaging plant that's being discussed here, but this is a common thing that the people who are going to profit from this, they keep on pushing it forward, and building the political power to block that is really the core of the problem of addressing climate justice. And I think that really the key action needs to be at the international level. That's where if there's no solution at the international level, everything we can do locally is not going to be nearly enough. But of course, local action is also important.
Thank you very much, Paul. And our next question is: the poor results of things like the Paris Climate Agreement make my high school students pretty cynical about big world meetings like that. Is there a better way for us to move forward?
Yeah, they have good reason for cynicism, sadly. Again, I think that these negotiations are among national governments, and the national governments have promoted their national interests, and with particular emphasis on or influenced by the big carbon polluters. We've seen that here in the United States. We see it in so many countries around the world. The carbon polluters are blocking their national governments from making the commitments that are really needed to achieve the Paris Agreement target. So, one thing we've seen is just more and more like rallies and marches and political action, and that's all very helpful. But I think that we need more in fact, a lot more strategic, politically focused organization if we're going to advance climate justice. That's not an easy thing for a high school student to do, but that's where we need to go. I'm working on that, but again, that would be a much bigger topic that I can address in 30 seconds.
And we're now going to move to the next question. Do you see any new and useful lessons we can learn from how we are addressing the current pandemic that could be useful for delivering better climate justice?
Well, sadly, I'm afraid that the pandemic is an example really of international failure, that if we had had the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization playing the kind of role they played with the Ebola disease, several years ago, if we'd had a US administration at the time that was taking these things seriously, so the Trump administration, I think we would have seen United States and Center for Disease Control, World Health Organization playing a much stronger role, much earlier, and much stronger international cooperation, and we would be nowhere near where we are in terms of deaths and the infections today. So sadly, Ebola, the COVID crisis is another example of international failure, similar to the climate crisis. And again, the basic challenge is that we need stronger international cooperation that really respects each human being as counting equally for one, and recognizing that some countries have greater advantages and need to do more. But the advanced countries, they say, oh, we're giving 200 million vaccines, right? Like that's like nowhere near enough. Where we have seen success, it has been through this international cooperation, but it's not nearly enough, and it needs to be so much strengthened. And so maybe this can be taken as an object lesson for not so much of success, but of failure for what's needed, for what we need to do more of if we're going to have any chance of reasonably addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, those are great insights. Thank you. Our next question is, people generally act upon their own self-interest. How do you make the needs of a migrant in a far-off country have meaning to some rural individual in Ohio? People
do act in terms of their own self-interest, but people also act in terms of fairness. And I think people in Ohio and Iowa and Michigan, they care about fairness as well as they care about their own interests. That caring about fairness in terms of people like far away in other countries is a big challenge. That for many people, the suffering of people in Chad or Bangladesh, doesn't strike them as a really big concern. But the reality is that it's the carbon emissions of advanced countries that have caused these problems. So in international law and international ethics, there's an understanding that advanced countries have an obligation to support developing countries from a humanitarian perspective, but this is not humanitarian. This is justice. With humanity, if they have like problems before, that maybe there's their problem. But with climate change, we've caused a problem, and so really there's sort of there's an educational effort to be done, but this responsibility of the advanced countries is, I would say, an objective responsibility due to our objective contribution to the problem. And so for those people for whom this is not a compelling issue, that's an organizing and educational challenge facing those who want to engage in the politics of this issue.
Thank you very much. So our next question, I absolutely love it, and I hope you can give us at least approximate answers. So when will Paul Clements give the how to approach the politics of climate change presentation? And I hope soon.
I actually have an answer to that. Not a presentation, but one of my most recent publications is not listed because it's just come out in October, is called Beyond Ideal Theory, Foundations for a Critical Rawlsian Analysis of Climate Justice. John Rawls wrote a theory of justice. He's my favorite philosopher, most influential philosopher of the 20th century, I believe. I'm teaching a class on his work in this coming semester. I think Rawls is great, but this paper, it's in the journal New Political Science. So if you just Google New Political Science, issue number 4, 2021, you can find Beyond Ideal Theory, my paper, where I lay out the strategy for approaching these problems politically.
So the next question is, what are your top 3 domestic examples of climate injustice that are not making headlines currently?
Well, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one because there's so many different domestic climate injustices. And also part of the challenge is that these injustices, they sort of play out on different timescales. So some of them happen sort of gradually, and some of them happen in big events, like when they're like these big superstorms and floods and so on. I would say that, okay, I think that probably the biggest injustice is that the U.S. federal government has continued to subsidize insurance on waterfront property, like it subsidizes all insurance, taxing all of us, taxing the people of the country. And so this is, and often even requires people when they get flooded out to rebuild. They're gradually beginning to change this, but this is still a big injustice where we subsidize the wealthy with their waterfront properties for their flood insurance, and then the rest of us pay for it. But then when there are big superstorms and when there are lots of people who lose their homes, then again it's been the people in the marginalized communities who are often the last and least supported by the federal government on these issues. Another area is we have a lot of hot cities that are getting a lot hotter, and generally it's the low-income neighborhoods where they already have the heat islands. Just having trees in your neighborhood can reduce the heat by more than 5 degrees, maybe even 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And a lot of low-income neighborhoods, because of historical reasons or whatever, don't have the trees and don't have the parks, don't have the facilities. So again, most of the deaths and health problems from the increasing heat waves that we're going to see come from the more vulnerable populations and from the neighborhoods where they don't have the basic supports. So that's a really big issue. That's 2 anyway.
Thank you again. And we're going to take just one more question. In your opinion, how important is it to reimagine what is it to be human in the Anthropocene to achieve equitable climate justice, even for non-humans on which all life depends?
Yeah, reimagining what it is to be human. People come we need some fundamental reorganization of society for sure, and people come at this from many different perspectives. I think that when we talk about reimagining what it is to be human, to some extent this kind of connects up with the earlier question about, well, people in Ohio may be thinking about people in like Chad or Bangladesh in terms of the different harms, and recognizing our common humanity and seeing the common humanity as fundamental to our approach to just basic political issues. To what extent is that reimagining, a part of what it means to be human? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I will say that my sort of background or perspective on this is fundamentally sort of ethical and political, and other people may take a more spiritual approach, which I think can be a very powerful one, or other people come from different philosophical traditions, which also have a lot to offer. But I see these issues as deeply and fundamentally ethical and political, and that in terms of the kind of organization that's needed to change the realities, I don't think we're going to see the change take place primarily through individual consciousness change. I think the change could take place primarily through focused political action, and political action focused strategically from a sort of international and the national perspective. And so that's where I try to focus.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Paul, very much for your really formidable presentation. It's been such a great inspiration. and such a great boost for all of us before the classes start next Monday. So you made me think about so many different aspects of climate change mitigation and adaptation and human migration as I am preparing to teach my global climate change class next week. So thank you so much. This is one of the presentations of the year by Climate Change Education Solutions Network. So if you want to know more about the future presentations that are happening every first Thursday of the month, always at 4:30. So you can follow our program at www.gvsu.edu CCS. Many thanks to all of you. Wanted again to acknowledge our sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts and Science at GVSU and the Michigan Space Grant. And I hope to see you all next month, the first Thursday of February. So thank you, Professor Clements. And I also hope that you will come back with another presentation because we really need to know more about how to improve our political system to address climate change.
Thanks for the opportunity. I very much appreciate it.